The Confederates historically have conducted crimes against the United States, such as the Monster of Jekyll Island, which then proceeded to the Pinkertons, who then created the functioning intelligence agencies such as the FBI, who then funded and maintained and invested into the Nazis in order to cause World War II, at which point these wizard functions throughout history of those who view themselves as worthy of taking over the world, as Final Fantasy VII's world parasite Genova and her son Sephiroth, which generates the pretense of their strategic targetings of corrupting the system in their conversions, at which point the FBI actively attacking presidents generates the pretense of the smear campaigns or the blackmail functions normalized from the foundation of the FBI as its primary purpose. At that point, the conversion for the service of the wizards against the United States has converted many of the presidents, which generates the question for what they're promoting with Donald Trump in the presidential immunity system, which is fraudulent as the president is captured by those not loyal to him in the executive who are, under American law, his legal subordinates. At which point, the presidential immunity's function is a subversion of the presidency, according to the secrecy function. At which point, all they have to do is not admit to it is their functional claim, which is fraudulent on its face, as it is destructive of the primary cause. Any action that, in its function, subverts the conclusion of the overarching goal is then fraudulent, and thus the act of undermining the president by giving the president too much overreaching power beyond the strict prohibition by the Constitution, which is the material authority the president has to swear to, has undermined the authority of the president in the overreach, and in that action has generated a series of converted presidents subsequently engaging in the Confederate insurrection against the United States, who, having targeted David Boles at birth, has acknowledged the ability of David as the aristocracy to have challenged their system, as David is estimated, according to the military intelligence, to being stronger than the Confederacy, according to that influence, which has then pushed itself to Congress in that secret function, who has then abandoned their role under the threats by the Confederacy, intimidating them into compliance against their responsibilities, as David chooses the Senate as the authority of the aristocracy, compels the obligation to turn him into intelligence oversight as its top ranked general, as anything that they offer in order to exchange for restriction requires them to offer it in the equivalent value, which puts David at the estimate as something along the lines of a six-star general with Congress specifically, and thus the act of securing and enforcing the will of Congress against the executive becomes the primary theory according to that establishment, which puts David directly as a threat to this insurrection by the overreaching of the presidency, similar to in the Bible when the king of Babylon was promoted to be a god by his subordinates who were jealous of Daniel, who said that because Daniel has no weakness except for his love for God, then by definition we will have to make God the reason we destroy him. And thus they say, O king, no one deserves worship except for you, and anyone who worships anyone except for you should be put to death. And thus the position is created to throw them into a den of lions. And this is functionally the same idea for the presidential immunity system. The presidential immunity is King Darius in that situation. Their worship of the presidency as king and not as president has generated the threat to the president's will, as when King Darius had to throw Daniel into the lion's den, he did so with great mourning and trepidation. He's severely regretting the decision, as it is counterproductive to his own aims to have done so, and yet the law in Babylon is stronger than the king, which is supposed to be true inside the United States for the president. But the king, having to be subordinated to that thing, could be tricked into saying something stupid. And the same thing goes with the president. As the law is supposed to be above the president, the overreach is strictly prohibited. And but the function of that being reproduced in the secrets is the attack on the presidency itself by the Confederate insurgents using their secret influences, as they systemically conduct voter fraud in order to replace the Congress and other elected officials, such as the judges. They materially change the offices from American into Confederate policy until it no longer reflects the responsibilities of the government that they are no longer serving. There is an agent in this record that I don't have a name or a number for, which sought to release David's title from the kidnappers under that justification before everything else happened, which got the legal ball rolling in secret while David is obstructed and thus could not be represented. And thus, the existence of having to go through the system without any representation or the ability to have influence in the outcome generates the pretense of fraudulent positions where the process becomes the punishment, which is against the law. The agent was then subverted by the insurrectionists kidnapping more children. The position then became for that agent to turn against David and for those children to turn against David as an alternative to them being abused in similar ways to David. Thus, in fear of pain of the assault, they then would have to actively subordinate themselves as the radicalized personnel captured by a cult have been radicalized for the defamation systems, which is an arbitrary thing, which I don't specifically have any good records for, but it's the act of using the government to threaten them in order to engage in the smear campaigns and the defamation systems. At which point, the system is actively then converted as they're being intimidated as children into the position allows them to be socially engineered by the hate group's social violence, which then propagates the normalization of the simulation as surrounding David by controlled situations generates their ability to control every aspect, including the kidnapping directly, which specifically enforces the general illusion that they wrote in their defamation, as the government does not have a right to make anyone guilty of anything, and the government does not have a right to make anyone an enemy of the government without due process, which is a crime that John Durham's character specifically committed, as James Comey wrote, a blackmail simulation for the kidnapping, which generates fraudulent policies to cover at the face of the thing uh, for the support of the general crime of their child predator system, as they, being the child predators in that situation, actively have to traumatize and destroy the general public from being able to protect itself, and thus the female Gnostics who say that the community should be able to raise children generates their support of the rape culture, which then abuses the children as they are functionally the same thing. And many of these promotions happened. Even Joe Biden has said that children belong to the community and not to the parents, which is a direct attack on the parents' rights, which by definition has been corrupted as well, as the parents' right activists have actively supported it for the influence of the rape culture as their ability to choose who their children date and don't date is specifically arranged by them, which is coercion for sex, as the children have no say in the matter, and thus the position of the normal protective nature of parents in the dating realm for their children is accelerated to a criminal degree, um, hyper controlling these options, including the amplification of the defamations, which are actions strictly prohibited by the use of the government, which is using the government's equipment against the law in order to conduct these black market operations in their system, trading for the outcomes for these results. Now, this is founded on their capacity to have accelerated this, as the problem was then amplified in the narrative by many of the child predators in the police force, claiming to have infiltrated California, which was then being propagated to instigate uh, a lawfare-based civil war where, like the Confederacy, it's they claim states' rights while overthrowing other states and subordinating them by coercion uh, to subjugate themselves to whatever arbitrary slavery things, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of them being able to find someone who they want to claim as a slave and have the state not be able to stop them from being able to return them, whether or not they were there in the first place, back to uh, those claiming that they have ownership. Uh, so, in that arrangement, you actively have the rebirth of the Confederacy. And this generates many of their arguments, which they were losing, requiring them to make a deal with the devil in I believe it was a deal made in the Bohemian Grove, which generates the devil worshippers' capacity to have laundered their karma in favor of acquiring their goal, as they uh, receive commissions spiritually, such as the ingestion of souls into hell, which allows them to amplify their power according to their religion. But they have to disconnect from the karma, so they need somebody to collect the negative karma instead of them as they make those promotions. And the pedophiles in California, under the system, loyal to the surveillance network who want to stalk children, have actively leveraged it, saying that they would accept the deal with the devil and sell their souls for the extreme purpose of their ability to conduct the surveillance powers, which generates the pretense of the presidential immunity systems, as many of the presidents, like I said before, have been corrupted and specifically curtailed into this position, which generates the compromise system, which is actively reinforced from that network of their ability to choose their preferred children for the sexual exploits under the rape culture, which is the reason child porn exists, um, because they made it. They had to rape the children for there to be evidence, which is the thing that they're actively going after, such as, but it's not limited to, their attack on journalists concerning the reporting of government secrets, which is the purpose of the First Amendment for journalist protections, to allow the journalists to say things that the government doesn't want to be said, and thus allow for the general public to generate uproar and specifically counter it and compel the government to stop for an extended or permanent period of time. And at that point, these systems are actively reinforcing itself for the protection of the secrets from the legal process, as many of them posture against the law that Congress doesn't have authority to receive the information, as they would then publish it. And thus, the claim is not just that the general public or that journalists don't have First Amendment right, but that Congress doesn't have a First Amendment right, as Congress's ability to say it is in the Constitution, and thus the position of Congress having the oversight specifically has to be able to say it in order for the oversight to functionally mean anything, as the influence of the coercion of the government by the nonviolent means is a legal mechanism, which is the highest form of government, and in that arrangement attack the foundation of the existence of the Constitution, and thus is an act of war against the Constitution, and thus is an overthrow of the authority which they have to swear loyalty to in their oath of office, which generates the pretense that they are disqualified from office, and in that act specifically have subverted the existence of the United States, which has generated the pretense from the Confederate insurrection to specifically infiltrate by voter fraud all of those offices, at which point what happens when the majority of those departments have been compromised by the insurrectionists? They are still a super minority of super predators, but they are in fact a minority and not a significant population of the United States. And thus, the obligation to law, and thus the obligation to the government, and thus the obligation from the government, and thus the obligation to law abiding civilians who are owed control over the government, are being targeted for violence by the warmongering Confederacy seeking to overthrow the authority or insurrection, which is the foundation of all of their arguments concerning their immunities, which they do not lawfully have, but are merely posturing by their insurrection. And in their act of conducting the kidnapping by bill of attainder and ex post facto, they seek to substantively change the nature of how society treats its government until they can ignore it entirely. Whereas the legal substantive changes, uh, which would be derived by the enforcement of the law in the war on David, acknowledging David Boles in his original authority according to the time of the case, including the contract schedule, which many in NATO didn't want to have to deal with as they were enjoying the benefits of fraud extorting the general public's, which they needed to be saved from as their primary strategies to kick the can down the road from their extortions, similar to a family that pays their credit cards off with credit cards. It's a doomed system, and thus their position is that they would rather die comfortably than deal with the problem, and thus they fundamentally hate the idea of David, which they already had in their minds from those estimates, because it would require them to acknowledge the treaties that they already had with David, and thus the existence of their obligation to do what they already knew they had to do in order to save their finances in the service of their countries, as the acknowledgement is the attack on the roots of David Boles and Don Boles Sr. Um, in their existence in the system, as those are the primary targets from their arguments. And their arguments stating that without their obstruction, they would have generated all of these business concepts, which includes the investigation into the future prosperity, which generates their trading of contracts of the right to go after certain services, such as David Boles stopping the crash of '08, which generates credibility in the bonus credit score, which generates confidence in the general market, which generates investments around him, at which point he then becomes a centerpiece for other people making trades who need to use credibility as a balancing act for their trade, which is in good faith and would be conducted normally, but it needs a third party to impartially subsidize the value. And in that regard, they create a legend company. And in that legend of David company, you would generate the historic positions as the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. Um, and if you don't have 10 years ago, you have today. And thus, the position requires them to have known it the exponential period of time ahead of time in order for them to have acquired the influence that they were looking for, especially for many of the fraudulent policies which cannot substantively survive on their own, requiring them to be propped up, which generates many of their frustrations, as many, such as Matt's character, were owed substantive powers and influence and properties, which generates from all of their collective influence, which they would have to sell to David in order to have gained the influence they're looking for. They had to have it in order for them to sell it. And then it then becomes sticky because they would have to disconnect David in that historic legend company as the balancing act, as many of their advantages are derived by crime, which requires them to specifically sell the service of having made those trades to them, which requires them to have sold the whole of Hollywood before they could even hope to start to get even close to even. And thus, they would have completely destroyed the foundation of all of their inherent self worth. And they, having sold that, do not possess it anymore. And thus, that creates the position for Ben's character, who says that they could just steal it with excessive force, excessive, unreasonable, irrelevant force, as it is foundational to their identity to engage in white supremacy communism. The idea is that if they just do the robbery directly, as the precedent, as the foundation requires them to have been able to have, as white supremacists, robbed the black community and many of the other communities, to have acquired the value in the first place in order to sell to David, that they have to get David to sell the rights to those services in the past to have purchased Hollywood is founded on, generates the arguments over fates. And again, the point of a bill of attainder and ex post facto is to conduct the kidnapping so that they um, can change the rules while the other party is restrained and muted. And thus, the act of the restraints and the mutes bars David Boles from filing any of the claims under his original title, which is the only way for him to file the claims. He needs access to that original title in order for that title, which is the person by definition, to engage in the communication with the government, which is criminal censorship by the government. And this has exponentially included its targeting by the systems from, I think, was the Unabomber's character, who said that David Boles was going to actively be connected with people in the School of Hard Knocks, hyper accelerating the technology into doing whatever the Unabomber said in his manifesto, um, which generates the assumption that David would have connected with Steve Jobs, uh, especially in his vulnerability when he was creating Next, which generates the foundational computer systems which David Boles would have been using, as the hyper investment from Steve Jobs into Next would have been balanced out by David's division to the general customer base, which was later adopted by Steve Jobs after he systematically lost the argument to David Boles in the record, which then was reinforced by the general market affirming everything that David Boles was telling Steve Jobs, and thus created the hyper accessible computer, um, which he was actively pushing for. But that is beside the point, as the hyper investment into upgrading the capacity of the personal computer was Steve Jobs' primary purpose, which receiving those additional funds would have been actively reinforced and substantively matured, which would have undermined the pretense of Y2K, which uh, would have actively been countered by the hyperacceleration from Steve Jobs' efforts as a specific mission. Um, but actively having contacts with the white supremacists was scared of their communists, acknowledging that they would destroy the market, similar to how they're destroying David anyways, disconnecting Steve Jobs' interest from it, generating Steve Jobs' active participation in the smear campaigns for the rewriting of history to make him look good so that those who are looking into the future would presuppose that Steve Jobs was the hyper tech genius and not Wozniak or David Boles or any of the others, at which point the hyper self promotion from Steve Jobs is a specific indicator of the white supremacist behavior, as they promoted him on that basis of affirming their social norm, of destroying your friends when your friends are better so you can cut in line and be perceived as better in their society of scam artists. The question ultimately comes to when the government is obligated to have published it to the general public, and the answer is from the beginning of the conspiracy. The moment the government knows about it, the government has to enforce the law against the conspirators before the fact, stopping the offense in the first place, which requires the mass distribution of the information, such as the promotion of news, which generates the government's official answer and its distribution, which then creates the pretense for all of the historic positions of when the government had to start admitting to knowing about David Boles um, before he was born. And in that acknowledgement starts the actual dates, um, which then is then subverted from the insider trading, which is common to the government, which would then use the position of their knowledge of David in order to engage in secret activities for national security, as the estimate acknowledges him as the aristocracy, and thus Congress, needing to gain control, generates the pretense of him being intelligence oversight. And at the position that David is a soldier first class inside the United States government, their ability to conduct secrets that Congress isn't directly publishing generates the pretense of the infinite past, which generates the pretense for them to not have a starting date, as publishing it to the general public would be subversive to Congress's missions in its opposition to threats to national security that would threaten the Constitution, which they've sworn subjugation to and loyalty to, and service to and defense of, as a pretext of their existence as Congress. And thus, the existence of the Confederacy or the construct of slavery against the Constitution is insurrection against the Constitution, requires the existence of the secrecy by definition for them to keep about David Boles, which generates their non publishing of the obligation under the pretext of national security in order to have a substantive force capable of defending the Constitution at service of Congress. And in that arrangement, specifically counter the Confederate and other threats to the United States of America, preventing them from being able to express the secret to the general public, requiring the active knowledge that all of these activities has to be conducted as a law-abiding civilian without government authority, while acting with the government's complete authority. And this contradiction infuses into itself the general pretense of the rights of the general public as a foundational quality of their concept of David Boles, which generates the materialization of the political ideal of the apolitical government office enforcing the law, and thus the general political idea for David Boles' political party is founded on that position as his obligation as general to engage in the rights of the general public to be able to enforce the law indirectly while being able to mature its goal, such as, but is not limited to, the materialization of the Underground Railroad, which they have firmly blamed him for. Now, when you go back just for a moment about Matt's character, who was actively connected to the rape culture Confederates. He actively promoted the concept that amongst the captured peoples was his sister, which he said was going to have to be a bitch to David in the framing, or they were going to force her to have sex with him, and thus Matt, in his incestuous position, normal to the Confederacy, uh, would have generated the taboo of the interracial relationship in order to promote his own short-term goals, um, by the reinforcing of the general argument by David's original kidnapper, to rape Matt's sister for the connection of selling products in exchange for other value, and thus the prostitution of Matt's sister and other attractive girls that they estimated on the basis of their lineages. They have a hot mom, so they're going to be hot, that kind of idea. Not just the weird stuff, as however you want to think about that, but not just the creepy white supremacist stuff, but the normal estimate that their kid's going to be attractive. But either way, that position is founded for the reproduction, which then generates the position that if they don't reinforce the construct of gaining revenge as an X that wasn't going to be able to succeed in the contract that they were looking for, as they were going to be replaced by somebody else, which generates the Confederate position of taunting or poking the Russian bear to attack Ukraine to generate the Ukrainian conflict, is founded on that pretense. So when Matt's sister agreed to do that, she agreed to the pretext of attacking Ukraine from Russia, which is the reason that happened, which is the reason David has always known that that was going to be a goal of theirs. He didn't even know what Ukraine meant at the time. At which point, this generates the collective ideal of how history happens, with additional essential context. Whereas without the context, everyone's completely aghast at the concept of what to do about anything. Mm, Probably we should throw a bunch of money at it, maybe. I don't know. If you're into War is a Racket by General Smedley Butler, then you understand the endless racketeering system specifically generated by the existence of the conflict. And if they can destroy Russia without risking any American soldiers' lives, then they're happy to do that, as their racism fundamentally compels them to make Russia the enemy so that they can generate these wars. So the existence of the Confederates having influence is the existence to be in a constant state of Cold War with the Russians, uh, set out for complete annihilation. So their strategies have actively reinforced themselves, the existence and the support of the fraud by their delusions, for the crafting and enforcing of their illusions as an enemy of the United States, as white supremacist wizards in the KKK, which do not have authority to use the American equipment. Now, the what was the character for Ted Cruz wanted to conduct eminent domain policies for the not just the criminal use of the government being able to compel a sale of property for government services, which um, the Confederate challengers to David Boles wanted to do, as the public service was conducted by the existence of David having it in the first place, and thus eminent domain is disqualified on its face. But then the existence of doing the Bill of Attainder and ex post facto facilitates their eminent domain claims concerning the compelled services or the criminal prohibited function of slavery directly, and thus in that action by their subversion conduct the illusion and delusion for the enforcement of their eminent domain in that arrangements, whereas they would, in the underselling of the value without impartially viewing it by a third party, according to the free market, which is the foundational obligation of the eminent domain according to the Constitution, is then subverted by taking a crap and putting an American flag in it, which undermines the foundational purpose of the thing, which is a direct attack and subversion of the Constitution, as they are not respecting the restrictions, as they're conducting it under that fraud. They want to sell David his own shirt under the eminent domain, whereas it's already David's property, and they're selling David's property, in order to justify the compulsion of the service, which David is already doing as general according to the obstructed value, which is then reinforced onto itself, generating the false pretense for their kidnapping structure, saying that from the clever use of words that is not so good at speaking, as they suck at definitions and thus they suck at words, which is normal to delusional psychopaths who use KKK logic, actively attack definitions and thus would seek the redefinition of subjects, such as the destruction of dictionaries and the redefinition of words, which is the foundational purpose for their attacks by the government secrets to do fake experiments to drive people crazy, creating the sexual identity being screwy by the he, she, him, her, z, zer kind of thing, where the infinite definitions of the pronouns and other radicalized delusions generates the infinite distraction which they can hire bullies to mock and abuse them over for having been victims in the first place. And these pretenses create those delusions as general public threat terrorists. Um, compound those delusions by the Hitler's big lie, where they just lie big enough, often enough until people accept it, beating them down with the fascism, which is the bastard children of communism, which has generated these types of struggle tactics for the enforcement of the illusions, which then allows them to have recrafted everything in its entirety. And thus, if words don't mean anything, then they mean everything, and thus the boundaries for the government don't exist under the Constitution, which by definition no longer has any authority. And thus, in George W. Bush's concept, if the agents specifically assigned to enforcing the Constitution are the ones breaking the Constitution, who is going to enforce the law against them? And thus, there is no one to enforce the Constitution. And thus, in that position, you create the general structure which requires the existence of David in order to protect David from the insurrectionists, as David's position enforcing the Constitution is the thing that would be enforcing the Constitution, which is removed by the sedition, so that the Confederates, acting independent to law, can conduct their arbitrary abuses, which again reinforces the general strategy of corrupting the presidency against the president, as he is then used as a shell in the husk by the Confederate parasite in the presidential immunity actions destroying the presidency. And thus the position of being able to discard and destroy the president by the Confederates, who, under their anarchical authority, do not need authority to conduct their arbitrary terrorisms, have permanently subjugated the president to infinite abuse, which they cannot escape from by the existence of that very same self-delusion of self-importance they have not earned and do not have a right to.